Um, so I'll talk a little bit about the history of where the Progressive Magazine came from. And, it was kind of sad as I was hearing, when I was being introduced, I was hearing the names of all the publications that I had written for that no longer exist. And I think that's really something that we've seen very dramatically in this country in the past couple of decades, but particularly accelerating in the last decade or so. And that is the closing of publications, newspapers, magazines, and so on. Partly because a lot of the world of news has gone to the internet, not necessarily a good thing, as we'll discuss here in a couple of minutes. And partly because just the world of media has changed so much. There's been so much consolidation, particularly in the world of broadcast media over the past couple decades. The Progressive grew out of a climate at the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, when there was lots and lots of newspapers. In fact, probably most households around the United States, and this is, rural farming households as well as urban households, were getting 2 to 3 newspapers a day, often delivered through the mail. And there was a postal subsidy that supported the distribution of newspapers. In fact, that was one of the things that Benjamin Franklin was a proponent of, that in order to have a functioning democracy, we had to be able to get newspapers into the hands of the people, because knowing about the news makes an informed electorate and gives people the power to make choices, make decisions, influence their elected officials. And that was something that the founders felt very strongly about. So coming into the 20th century, you had many, many, many different publications in many different languages. If you looked at a newsstand in New York City, you would probably see at least 20 different languages on the front of daily newspapers at that time. And the other thing about papers in those days is that they had a point of view. And oftentimes that point of view is still reflected in the name of the paper, the Arizona Republican, the Kansas City Democrat, and so on. These newspapers very unabashedly took a position. And that was part of the way that debate happened. People got these newspapers delivered to their home, often with several different points of view, and they could read what was going on, what people thought on this side of an issue, on that side of an issue, and they could make their own informed decisions. Now, what happened in the world of media beginning around the 1920s or so is there was a shift from this idea of newspapers that were instruments of advocacy to a notion of a so-called objective press. And I say so-called because there really is no such thing as objectivity in the press. I don't know what they're teaching you in the classroom, so I don't want to naysay the faculty there. But basically, every journalist goes into a situation with a particular set of blinders. My particular set of blinders is, white male, raised in the public school system of North America, of the United States in the latter half of the 20th century, and that's what colors my worldview in so many ways. But as a journalist, your job is 2 things. One, to acknowledge that you have those built-in biases, those built-in assumptions. And secondly, to give voice to the people whose stories you are telling. As a journalist, you go out and you interview people about a topic, about an issue, about something that they believe in, about something that they've experienced, and you have a sacred duty to deliver that information to your readers. So for a long time, Fox News was calling itself fair and balanced, and it was pointed out in a court of law that they were neither. But really, what a journalist needs to do is they need to be fair, they need to be open, and they need to be honest. And those are the things that really go into making a good journalist. And journalists are basically good storytellers, people who gather information and who give voice to those who are otherwise unrepresented or underrepresented in the media. So they're sharing these stories of everyday working people with a broad national audience in the case of national publications, or with a local audience in the case of local publications. So that's the kind of journalism that the Progressive comes from. And the idea, again, right in the name, the Progressive, this is not a publication that is going to espouse a right-wing capitalist worldview. This is a publication that is going to represent and showcase the work of progressive movements working for change to make the world a better place. In our history, the areas that we have focused on is the influence of money in electoral politics. This goes back all the way to the very beginning of the magazine in January 1909. The founder, Robert M. La Follette, who was a governor, a senator, and he was a Republican when he started. He eventually ran for president as a progressive, forming a new progressive political party. But he came out of this movement of politicians working to make social change. And it was, in fact, from Wisconsin and the efforts of many politicians in Wisconsin that we got things like child labor laws and workers' compensation, and the first government employees unions started in the state of Wisconsin, and so on. So this is the movement that La Follette represented. And he wanted a newspaper that would speak to that movement, that would showcase both the struggles and the goals of that progressive movement. So again, the areas, getting money out of politics, having more direct democracy, more people involved in the decision-making process. It used to be that senators were chosen by state legislatures. We think now about the elections for Senate that are coming up in many states in about 5 weeks from now. And in the early 20th century, senators were chosen. So that was one of the things that La Follette worked on. Another thing this magazine has always stood for is opposition to war and militarism. During World War I, La Follette was burned in effigy and almost thrown out of the U.S. Senate because he said that World War I was a bad idea. That's now sort of accepted fact. People say, World War I was a bad idea. We had no business getting into World War I. It wasn't about fighting for democracy. It was about these various ruling parties kind of carving up the globe. And La Follette was opposed to that from the beginning, spoke on the floor of the U.S. Senate against it, and was vilified in his time. So the magazine has stood for peace and anti-militarism. This was true during World War II as well, even though during the actual years of the war, the magazine was supportive of the fight against fascism in Europe and Japan. The general criticism, the critique that appeared in the pages, was making sure that this wasn't setting up a permanent military state, that this wasn't creating a military industrial complex, which of course, Eisenhower spoke about in his farewell address in 1960. The magazine through the 1950s was opposed to Senator Joseph McCarthy, a Wisconsin senator who was running a witch hunt against people of differing political views. And The word McCarthyism today is used to talk about that time and that attitude, and you see many references today to the new McCarthyism, as you see things like Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida passing bills that say that school teachers can't talk about ideas like critical race theory or communism or gender equality. And so that people today say that's the new McCarthyism that's happening today, the book bannings that are happening in school districts all across the country and so on. This magazine has stood against that from the beginning and continues to. In the 1960s, we were very supportive of the civil rights movement. We were opposed to the Vietnam War. In the 1960s and 70s, we were opposed to U.S. Military adventurism in Central America. In the 80s, we were opposed to the two wars in Iraq in 1991 and again in 2003, and so on. Also, very much taking a stand against nuclear weapons. And in 1979, the Progressive was involved in a national court case where the government tried to keep us from publishing an article about the H-bomb. The article was described as being how to build an H-bomb. What it was actually about was how the whole notion of secrecy is a fallacy, and that the whole idea of the Cold War that was built up around keeping these atomic secrets was a fallacy, that you could walk into a library and get this information that we published in this article. So that's the kind of things that we've been involved in over the years. In more recent years, we've also been very involved in supporting public education. We have a program called the Public Schools Advocate that works to support the idea of public schools rather than the privatization of education. And we've also been very involved in a project called Progressive Perspectives, which works to diversify the op-ed pages of newspapers around the country by training people how to write op-eds and then distributing them through newspapers in small towns and large cities across the country. These are op-eds that are written by writers of color, written by writers who are incarcerated, written by writers who are expressing, all the various values that I spoke about that our magazine has stood for since its beginning 113 years ago. So that's a little bit about the Progressive. I just want to really quickly touch on kind of the media landscape of the last few decades, because I think that it will dovetail very much with what you've been studying there in the classroom. My background before coming to the Progressive was community radio. I've been very involved in, I worked in community radio in various ways for 35 years, not only in the United States, but internationally. There's actually an international community radio movement, and community radio is in many ways growing more in other parts of the globe than it is here in the United States, partly because community radio can reach that last mile where the internet oftentimes cannot in many situations. Also, many countries have just recently opened space to allow for the development of community radio stations, whereas before that, all of the radio frequencies were owned by the government or the military in some cases. And so there's been a blossoming in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America over the past couple of decades. And so that's been a big growth and very important growth area, because again, it's really about people controlling their media, people making their own media and telling their own stories. And the last thing I'll just talk about for a minute is what happened here in the United States during the Vietnam War, the independent press movement that grew up with lots and lots of small independent newspapers all across the country. In New York, the Village Voice is probably the most prominent one, but there was many small newspapers in every city and town around the country, actually, that were created by people to provide an alternative to what folks saw as a very narrow mainstream perspective. Remember, in the 1960s and most of the 70s, everybody got all of their news basically from the three networks on television. You'd turn on the TV and you'd see Walter Cronkite or somebody, and they would tell you what was going on in the world. And that was the only perspective on the news. And these alternative publications were showcasing all of the different movements for change, opposition to the Vietnam War, the growing women's movement, the growing Black Power movement, and so on and so forth. So you had, the Black Panther Party had a newspaper that was available in 60 or 70 cities across the United States, cities and towns. You had various feminist publications that were available, usually in small regional networks of bookstores, newsstands, things like that, bringing information to people that they were not getting from the 6 o'clock news. And that movement in the late 1980s, early 1990s, inspired a movement of pirate radio, small radio stations, radio transmitters that people were getting hold of, and doing that same kind of micro broadcasting to small communities. I believe there's one in Ithaca or near Ithaca that has been around for a couple of decades now. And then from that came a thing called the indie media movement. Indie media, INDY, MEDIA, indie media, which started as a bunch of activists wanting to put out news and information on the internet. It really kicked off around 1996 at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, but it saw its peak, or not its peak, but its real, when it really became known around the country was at the WTO protests in Seattle in November of 1999. And I wrote an article about this that I should remember to share with you by email. But basically, the idea of indie media was taking people who were activist journalists, that is, they were involved in movements, teaching them how to write, how to gather audio with a portable recorder, and how to gather video. And then putting all that material together and putting it up on the internet through an open publishing form where people could get news out about things that were happening in these burgeoning movements, at that time, movements against globalization. So you had the WTO protests, and later throughout the 2000s, many other anti-globalism gatherings where people were using the tools of globalization, basically like the internet, to confront this corporate globalization that was happening, where the big rich companies were trying to gather up all their pieces of the pie. And so that's what really spurred this indie media movement. And all of those things that were developed by indie media in the late 90s and early 2000s have since been picked up by all the major media. And so now you have CNN putting people's cell phone video of Hurricane Ian up on the screen, and that really developed out of this notion of indie media in the 1990s. So I'll leave it there, and I want to open it up for questions and talk about all these things and other things that you folks want to address.
Thank you so much, Norman. That was a really great magisterial overview. And maybe I'll ask the students if they have a question or something they want to explore further. I don't know. I do have some questions, but anyone want to? Oh, yes, Imba, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hi, I just had a question about, you mentioned working with community radio. Could you talk more about that? Because I'm very interested in radio. I would like to throw that out.
Yes, very much. So in the mid 1980s, a group called AMARC, AMARC, which is the World Association of Community Broadcasters. It's actually a French acronym, which my French is so poor that I'm not going to try and pronounce it right now. But it's the English name is World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, and the name is AMARC, AMARC, was formed and worked to support the development of community radios in regions all around the globe. And so the organization was actually divided into regional networks. Some of that still exists. Some of it has shrunken or gone away, basically because other activities, mostly local activities, have kind of taken the place. But what you saw throughout the late 80s, all through the 90s, and all through the 2000s was this blossoming of community radio. And what we did, I was part of a team that went around and helped do trainings in different places around the globe, particularly linking it to some of the larger global events like the World Social Forum. The World Social Forum was something that started in Brazil. The first one was in 2001 in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and went on for there was one in Montreal in 2016. There was a smaller one a couple of years later, but I have not attended any since 2016. But basically, we would go there and we would work with a team of local community radio journalists, whether in the case of some of the ones in Brazil, we gathered people from all over the globe. So we had a journalist from South Africa, another one from the Gambia. We had somebody from Argentina, somebody from several people from Brazil, of course. And we put together a team and we did broadcasting, sometimes 11, 12 hours a day in half a dozen or more different languages, in French, Italian, English, Spanish, the colonial languages, but also very often in some of the indigenous languages. In 2013 and 2015, we were in Tunis, in Tunisia, and helped there with developing some brand new community radio stations, because Tunisia had just undergone its transition in the Arab Spring in 2011, and helping to start up a women's only community radio station in Tunisia outside of Tunis, helping to support the half a dozen or so stations that were there, which later grew to quite a few more that served the different communities in that country. And that included programming in Berber, the language there that was used by some of the nomadic farmers, and of course also French and Arabic. So those are the kinds of programs that we put together. And the idea was, you go into these places, you have a news event that you can coalesce around, but you're also doing capacity building, giving people the tools to make their own programming, make their own news. And these community radio stations, serve their communities in a variety of ways with educational programming, things that they're not getting in the schools, but it's available over the radio. Health information, oftentimes a lot of political information in the sense of just, how do you vote? How do you register? How do you participate in the electoral process? And then there's a lot of very localized things. Like there was a radio station we worked with in Ghana that had a program where they would send a reporter out in the morning with a cell phone to the fish market. And they would find out the price that the fish was selling for. And then they would call back to the radio station and be put on the air, and they'd talk about the fish price, so that the other vendors who were walking into town didn't get cheated on the way by somebody saying, oh, I'm going to give you the best price. It'll be better than what you'll get in the market. Well, they've already heard on their radios that no, the market price is such and such. So those kind of things happening in each individual community, depending on the needs and issues that are being faced by the people in those communities. So that's some of what the community radio movement is like around the globe. Here in the United States, community radio is a little bit different. It's much more established. There's a designated sector of the radio band for community radio, which was set aside beginning in 1967, set aside for non-commercial radio. So it includes community, college, public radio, and religious broadcasters. There's a set aside for that. And the community radio here in the US has a different kind of funding model as well, because there's a lot of people have a lot more disposable income than in many of these other countries. And so the community radio stations here are all non-commercial, and they get their funding through listener donations of support. In many other parts of the world, community radio includes advertising, though usually it's by local businesses in the community, but that's the way that they make their money. So it's an interesting but important distinction.
Right. Thank you. Any other questions about the progressive, about some of the points that Norman highlighted? Yes, go ahead.
It's Hannah. So I had a question about, the progressive has been around since the early 1900s. Like, when exactly did it make its leap from print to being online, and what was the thought process behind that?
Very good. Very good. Thank you. So this is a really interesting story. The Progressive started in January of 1909 as a weekly. It ran as a weekly for a few years, but financially could not sustain that. It became a monthly. And, as any independent publication, one of our struggles is always raising enough money to keep going. So there was a couple of really rocky times in the history of the Progressive where it looked like it was going to close, or in fact it did close a couple of times for a few issues and then reopen. But we've managed to survive as a print magazine still into today, although now we are a bi-monthly, so we come out 6 times a year in print. However, beginning in I want to say it was around 2004, 2005, the magazine also started moving content to the web. And, it's an interesting story in the United States about what has happened, how newspapers and publications went to the web. And this is kind of, it's getting lost in the dust of memory now. But back in the mid 1990s, very few newspapers had any content on the web at all. And those that did put up their content, it was basically PDFs of the printed page. And the first newspaper to really take advantage of the things that the internet could do was a paper called the San Jose Mercury News, which in 1996 ran a series of articles by a journalist named Gary Webb. And you should look it up because it's a really interesting story. The articles are still available online. And Gary Webb's story has been told in a couple of books and also a major motion picture called Kill the Messenger, which came out about 5 or 6 years ago. But the story is that this was about an investigation he did into the connections between the CIA and the crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. And one of the things they did is they linked stuff. So unlike just throwing up a PDF of the newspaper printed page, they would have an interactive website where you could go and you could click on something and you could hear the audio interview, or you could read the original documents. And that was a whole new way of using the internet for news. And I think it really deserves some special recognition. Nowadays, we all do that. And that's how the internet is structured. Everything is, nested sets of links. And when we do an article on the web, you're reading the article and you see, a term or something and you click on it and you'll get back to the original source document or the interview where that appeared. And that's how it's done. And I think it's making the best use of what the internet provides. So the Progressive started in about 2005, putting content on the internet. Mostly it was just, articles. And we developed the style that we have now, probably, I would say, over the past 7 years, which is we use the magazine for long form pieces of writing, things that you want to sit down with and turn the pages, and things that take a deeper dive, and things that aren't specifically breaking news. And then we use the web for the articles that are, this is something that's happening this week, or this is something that's happened in the last couple of weeks. So the web is really the place where we can address more immediate news in a world where, CNN and others are on 24 hours a day talking about the news. Well, we get a couple stories up every weekday, but there's no way that we're going to compete with CNN in terms of being able to break daily news. We're too small of a shop, but we can use the web as a place to keep people apprised of things that are going on right now. And then we also have an email newsletter that we send out. And all this stuff is free, by the way. You can go to our website and read all of our content for free. The magazine subscription, obviously, we charge a price for that, but we make it very affordable. And there is something about having a print magazine in your hand that still really gives a sense of importance to the articles, I think, in a way that the web does not. And so I think it's really still a useful way to view it, is that the print magazine is these longer think pieces, and the web is used for more breaking news. So that's the system that we've developed, and it took us 10 years to develop it. And it's, we're always honing it and fine tuning it, but that's really how we approach it.
Thanks, Norman. And, you also referred to the concentration of media ownership. And, we have discussed in our class this particular topic. So obviously you have seen many decades of journalism. I mean, so the current moment with this unprecedented concentration of media ownership, I mean, what do you make of it? And, is there a way out? I mean, how can we address this particular issue when the, big corporations not only own media outlets, they also own the internet provision, internet streaming, magazines, films. So there's this whole monopolistic, oligarchic sort of, landscape of media.
Right. They call it vertical integration, I think, where, you put out the movie, and then you own the TV network that interviews the actors and the directors, and then you own the newspaper that runs the ads for the movie, and then you own the distribution networks that, whether it be theaters or web streaming services that allow people to see the movie. And that's something that, has developed and accelerated in the last decade or so, particularly with the advent of all these different streaming services. There's so many streaming services out there right now. It's almost like the early days of all these different publications. You would have to subscribe to 6 different magazines. Well, now you have to subscribe to 6 or 7 different streaming services in order to get this one that's only available on Hulu, or this one that's only available on Showtime, and so on and so forth. Well, I think that in general, the shrinking of media is a bad thing, no matter what. And the example I'll use is radio. After the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was signed by Bill Clinton, there was this massive consolidation of radio stations. And what happens is, for instance, here in Madison, there was a company that owned 6 radio stations. They put them all in one building. They have one engineer who services all the radio stations. They have one sales staff that's going out and selling advertising for all the 6 different stations. Maybe they have different hosts on each one. They're doing the programming. But the point is the number of bodies in the room is decreased dramatically. And when you have fewer heads in the room, even if they're all Republicans or even if they're all Democrats or whatever, you have fewer heads, you have fewer different sets of ideas. And so you decrease diversity of opinion, you decrease diversity in many different ways. Of course, fewer staff also means fewer people, fewer jobs. But this idea of consolidation as a detriment to diversity, I think is a key thing to understand, that it's not about, the corporations don't have to be against diversity. They simply by default are creating a lack of diversity because the nature of capitalist business is to shrink the entity so that they can cut corners and save costs and make more money. So I think that's a very important thing. The other thing about consolidation that's happening right now that's really just, I think, devastating. We're seeing something like 2 newspapers a week that are closing around the country right now. It's very dramatic. And a lot of it has to do with hedge funds buying up these media products, newspapers, magazines, small broadcast networks, and so on, and then chopping them up and selling off pieces of them. And that's kind of the nature of the hedge fund world. And so what happens is you have, a newspaper and the hedge fund buys it, and the first thing they do is they lay off a bunch of the staff on the newsroom that were doing local journalism coverage, and all of a sudden the paper doesn't have any more coverage of what's happening in city government or what's happening in state government, and so on and so forth. Now, in answer to the other part of your question about what can we do about that, there's a couple of things, and one, I want to reference a book by Robert McChesney and John Nichols that came out a while ago now. It's called The Death and Life of American Journalism. And one of the things that they point out in that book is that in the United States, the support for journalism, and particularly public journalism, public broadcasting, public radio, public television, and publicly funded nonprofit journal, magazine and print entities is tiny compared to the rest of the world. And they do some charts where they say, in Sweden, so and so much percent of every tax dollar goes towards public media. In France, so and so many percent of tax dollars goes towards public media. In the United States, it's this little tiny, percent of a penny or something like that. And so that one solution that they offer is we really need more public funding of media in this country, realizing that media, public media, independent public media, is an essential component of a free and democratic society because it creates the educated electorate that is able to voice their opinions and their preferences and desires to their elected officials in this thing we call representative democracy. So that's the one piece. The other thing is there are a lot of different experiments going on. Unfortunately, none of them super successful yet, but things like reader-supported news. There's independent networks of what they call the state's newsrooms network, where they have about 11 different states around the country where they've set up these little small bureaus of journalists to cover what's happening in the state capitol because the main newspaper in the town isn't doing it anymore. One example is the press room here in the Wisconsin state capitol, which is a couple of miles from where I'm sitting right now. I used to walk in there and it would be bustling with people. Now you go in and it's basically empty. There might be one person sitting in there, scribbling on a notepad. And you see that in state houses all across the country. And it's really a detriment to the public's ability to know what's going on in their government. So there are these independent efforts. Ultimately, you need big pots of money to make this happen. You've got to be able to pay people salaries to live and to work, and the cost of living is actually quite a bit more than it was in the 1960s when we had this sprouting of independent alternative newspapers and so on. Again, a lot of it built around the anti-war movement, but you can't afford to live in an apartment for $60 a month anymore like you could in 1968. So it's it's a very different world. So there needs to be money available, and it seems pretty clear that the size of the amounts of money that we're talking about is something that a government could and should provide.
Right, yes, that's for, they've been arguing about this model, and we are going to read about this in a couple of weeks on public broadcasting and what can we do to address some of the problems we've identified. So Norman, as you know, many of us students here are juniors and seniors. They'll be soon leaving college and looking forward to a career in journalism. The landscape doesn't really look promising. Hearing about empty rooms, job cuts, consolidation. What advice would you give to them? Because this is often a question that I'm asked in both classroom and outside the classroom. And I really am myself at a loss as to what to say, because I do believe in public interest journalism. But at the same time, we have to give a realistic view of the world, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting because one of the pieces of advice, and my own career path is not a good example to follow. It's students often ask me, "How did you get into journalism?" And I explain that I started out as an archaeologist, and it was a whole different pathway. But I stumbled into what I do, and I did it bit by bit, and I've never never made a lot of money doing it, and that's certainly an issue nowadays, much more than it was when I got started. But one of the things I always tell students is, and it's harder to do now, but to get a job at a daily newspaper. The things you learn in working on deadline for a daily newspaper, even if your job is, the obituaries or the traffic reports or whatever, the kinds of things that you learn are indispensable in terms of shaping your journalistic habits in later life. The second thing I would recommend, and if you get a chance to see the book that I worked on called Rebel Reporting, John Ross used to give lectures to college students like yourselves at schools around the country, and basically go somewhere else, go to another country if you can, and do reporting from there, whether it be working with a news outlet in that country or whether it be reporting freelance back to the United States. But the experience that you get seeing and working with other journalists in other world situations is also dramatic. I remember when we went to Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2002, they had a room set up for us, and we were supposed to get this high-speed internet connection to do our broadcasts, and we were waiting for the thing to get installed, and there was all these problems, and the first day or so was kind of a loss. Meanwhile, some of the other Latin Americans who were there were getting on their cell phones, doing reports back to their stations, and so on, using the tools that are available. And those kinds of things that you learn from working with people in other countries and other situations are invaluable. So I encourage very much, working in a daily paper, working in other situations in other countries, and freelancing. When you're freelancing, you get to work on the things that you want, that you're interested in, that you feel passionate about. That lets you really build and develop the story that you want, but you still have to sell it to somebody. And so, you really have to learn the craft of how to pitch, how to, put together a piece that fits this audience or that audience, how to edit something to make it as tight and as good as possible for the amount of time or space that's available. So those are all tips that I offer. Don't do what most journalism schools do, which is let yourself get pushed into public relations. That's probably the most common career path now in journalism schools around the country, and I urge against it because it's really it's a different world, and it doesn't teach you as much, and it doesn't really hone your craft nearly as well, in my opinion. And then finally, something that you folks probably, all of you know much better than I, which is all the different forms where a story can be distributed. I worked with the folks at Democracy Now! Back in the mid 90s, and we were talking about how to get the program out. I went to a conference in San Salvador where we had some people from the Czech Republic who came and talked about the idea of streaming video over the internet, which was sort of a brand new concept in 1998. But this one Guatemalan farmer got up and he said, well, in our village, we don't have internet. We barely have electricity, and the people speak, several of 23 different indigenous languages. How is this going to be useful in getting the news to our people? And that's when we talked at this conference about the idea of what I call multi-platform distribution, taking the same story, but distributing it over the internet, the high-speed internet, to people who can get it, over fax machines, which was a big tool that we all had back in the 1990s, print, radio, particularly community radio, particularly translating it into various indigenous languages. And so that kind of multi-platform distribution is the model that Democracy Now! Has taken. And you'll see, they're on public radio, public television, community radio, Dish Network. They send out a newsletter, an email newsletter. You can watch the program on the web. You can read the headlines in your email, or you can read the headlines on the website. You can hear it in Spanish. They do a Spanish language version of the news headlines as well. So all of those things as ways to get the message out to more and more people. And now there's so many new social media platforms emerging, WhatsApp and Telegram and TikTok and so on and so forth, each of which has their own rules, their own methods, and are used differently in different places. WhatsApp was used very effectively by Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro when he ran for president in 2018, and now this last campaign he was using Telegram as a way of getting the message out to his right-wing supporters. So there's lots of different avenues out there to get the message out, but the trick, I think, is to try and get it out on as many as possible, to reach as many different people in as many different ways as possible. And those are the kinds of things that I think you can learn now in a college journalism class, learn the techniques, but also the mindset of how to do that, so that when new platforms come available, you have the tools to be able to figure them out and use them to their best advantage.